I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, breaking down the plans that promise to end discrimination against on-reserve First Nations children who are in the child welfare system.
I think that I'm comfortable because this plan is building on the continued commitment that was put forward previously. We have also included new roles and responsibilities for how community can engage. Most importantly, in working with the Assembly of First Nations, they're there to take the direction and representation of First Nations communities. This is the same space that I'm working in, that I'm here to take direction and reaffirmation of First Nations communities. We are essentially walking on the same path in parallel. I think we are going to arrive at the same outcome. I have confidence that when First Nations communities want to decide for themselves what their outcome is going to be, that I'm going to respect that as a First Nations minister. When I go to the Assembly of First Nations and work with them in that space, I'm also going to respect what it is they're trying to do in that space. Communities have the right to determine and define for themselves what their future looks like. That also includes defining how they get there. So as I said previously, I'm here to work with all parties who are at the table: Assembly of First Nations, National Children's Chiefs Commission, the Caring Society. At the end of the day, we all have the same mandate. It is to serve children and their families in a timely way with urgency. This file has been ongoing since 2016. I think it's really our responsibility to showcase that we can move forward working together, collaborating, defining what community is asking us to do, and giving them the opportunity to ultimately determine what they would like to do for the future of their children in care.
That was Indigenous Services Canada Minister Mandy Gull-Masty speaking to reporters at the end of December. It was shortly after the government tabled a plan at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to end discrimination against on-reserve First Nations children. As the minister mentioned at the end of her clip, it's been exactly 10 years that the tribunal ruled that Canada willfully and recklessly discriminated against First Nations children in care by underfunding the programs that were supposed to help them compared to children in care off reserve. The tribunal ordered Canada to work with the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society to work out a plan to put a stop to it. But 10 years later, children and families are still waiting. However, as we just heard from the minister, the government now has a plan. And to discuss it, I'm joined now by Minister Gull-Masty. Minister Gull-Masty, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, good morning, Wajah. Thank you for having me.
So, to start, back in December, the government introduced its plan for long-term reform of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. And, there's a lot to unpack, but I'm wondering, to start, what in your eyes are some of the most important things to understand about this plan?
Thank you. This has been one of the files at Indigenous Services Canada that has really, really weighed heavy on my heart because it has the most significant impact for the long-term life of an Indigenous child in Canada. We have been in a challenging position, I'm going to say. For the past 10 years, there has been a lot of, decision making. There has been a lot of representation and presentation on what happens to children that are going into care. And we are reaching a point where, I feel very strongly as a minister when communities ask me to ensure that this file moves forward, and when communities engage with Indigenous Services Canada asking that they undertake the mandate to deliver service within their nation, that it is something that I have to respect. First Nations, we are one people across the country, but we are also very unique and different in our language and our cultural practices, our relationship with our territory. So I really want to reflect that as part of my approach. But I'm also, I want to be very clear that while we undertake this approach in trying to work and support communities directly through regional agreements, we are open to those communities that are looking to participate in like a larger space, a larger discussion. We really need to meet community where they are and support them with the capacity that they have and try to create the tools that they need, because This is a critical file.
And so you mentioned, how the plan sort of caters to regional differences and some of the unique needs of communities. Can you expand on that a bit more?
Sure. The CHRT is looking to see how Canada is going to move forward. For us, it's really, I'm seeing the strength and the success of what was negotiated and developed in Ontario. They have really been very vocal with what they have determined for their members. I think they've done really, really great work. It is a model that I am recommending other First Nations to take into consideration. The key to success in this space for me as an Indigenous person is first and foremost to ensure that when children are going into care, one of the most vulnerable times of their life, that they have that continued connection to who they are as a First Nations person. They are connected to their community. They are surrounded by people that they know who love and care for them, that they have the cultural component of language, of continued ability to practice, their rights as a First Nations person, be it either through traditional activities or engaging in land-based programming. These things are really, really important to build the confidence, the security, and strength of an Indigenous child. And having that approach based on a regional structure, a regional framework, engaging members of the community to be that support mechanism, I think is for me one of the strengths that we have as First Nations people. So it is complex sometimes because, I'm going to say the lines that are kind of drawn around where a region starts in some places is, the provincial boundary. There are some nations that span across provincial boundaries. So really trying to meet with regions or meeting with nations to determine how they want to move things forward, we have to have a lot of flexibility in those discussions. We cannot come with one mindset, one approach to saying, no, you're within Ontario, we're dealing with you within Ontario, because we do know that there are cases and instances in certain places where nations span across 2 or 3 provinces. But we have to be really creative to make sure that when we are engaging and when we are designing this approach, that it is meeting the needs of the First Nations child first and foremost, that we are supporting it with critical resources to ensure success, that we are allowing communities to really define and entrench in this process the cultural component, and that we as a government are looking internally, myself as a minister, to see what can we do as an interface within this ministry to look to what the goal of this process is, to end the discrimination. We know that CHRT is there to uphold that, to address that. I feel very strongly about that as well. There is a decision that needs to be made. There are funding dollars that need to be allocated, but there's also the human component, and that is, going to be within those people who are going to be working together on the field, that direct frontline service care. And I want to be sure that as we empower them, we are also doing the reflection and the exercise internally of how do we move forward with this new model.
So, in the past, Canada has spent a lot of time and money in court pushing back against the AFN, First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and the Tribunal. Do you see that coming to an end under your watch and with this new plan?
I think what people have to understand about how government functions is when there is a court challenge, they are required to do due process as part of the engagement within that. As each minister comes into this role, they take on their own approach. They work very closely with justice. Justice gives you advice on what you shouldn't, where you should go with your direction. For me as a minister, I have seen that the continuity of being in front of the CHRT and waiting for a decision has been one that has had, I'm going to say, a negative impact on the timeline of getting a solution put into place, put into action. That's why we felt, myself, I really requested to ensure that I can move forward with this file to start that engagement, to begin discussions around regional agreements, even before CHRT has taken a decision. The best solution to a dispute is to find it amongst ourselves. And I have a lot of faith I have a lot of trust in First Nations communities to come forward, to meet me in a space of good intention, to push this file forward. I have a lot of respect for the work that has been done in the past. There's been huge undertakings. But honestly, that end of discrimination, that solution-driven focus to supporting kids, the urgency that is required is not often found in a timely, court process. This is why we are really working. We have started to do outreach to communities who've sent me letters, who have expressed interest to participate in this. I've received band council resolutions. We are already starting to do that engagement. This week, we sent out letters across the country informing nations if they are interested in this process. Please contact us. We want to work with you. There's been a lot of amazing work done in this file. We are not starting from scratch. We have a lot of information that we can work with. We have good ideas that exist. I think moving forward and really ensuring that we come to an outcome in a timely way is going to complete the one and most important essential outcome for this file, that we can support kids as soon as possible.
And can you talk a bit about how the government's new plan is different from what Chiefs turned down in 2024?
When this discussion happened and, the resolution didn't carry agreement to the national approach, it was really clear some of the feedback that I had heard at that time, when I was in my role as a Grand Chief, when I was speaking to my colleagues, was really that there was not a reflection of the individual identity of nations. This was the biggest concern. I didn't hear people say, I don't like the dollar figure. They just wanted to be sure that they protected who they were as a nation within the process. So we took that. I've always held on to that information, and I looked at trying to create a new path forward, looking at long-term reform that is one that is going to acknowledge the regional realities of First Nations, because they often, across provinces, we see different needs emerging, we see different relationships, we see different levels of capacity. So really trying to refine and make sure that our new regional agreement approach reflects that is one that is going to allow for what they asked for in the last round of discussions to come to the forefront. This is also, we have the same financial commitment. As you are aware, we are always, even through these negotiations, even through the CHRT process, we are always funding anything that is related to children that are in care, any kind of services that are offered. We are obligated as government to do that. We are maintaining our commitment where we are. But for the future of the discussions that we're having for regional agreements, I am really focused on making sure that that component of empowering communities, building capacities, working with frontline resources and services, making sure that we are making the fundamental and foundational aspect of how we take care of children to be entrenched in their identity as First Nations kids. That is really, really a critical part of the work for me, and only they have the capacity, the knowledge, and the expertise to do that. I do know that in looking at a national approach, there are some things that you could undertake at a national level. There are some like general prevention, general information. I think that does exist. Should a region wish to opt into having a component of national approach, that's really up to them. They're the decision makers. I'm here to work with them and respect who they are as a First Nation. But I really think the strength of what they want to do and trying to drill down and look at that regional element of, how they can deliver quickly with urgency, with care, with the responsibility that they need and addressing and supporting kids and where they are, that is really my focus.
Thank you for that. And so the National Chiefs Children Commission, along with the Caring Society, put forward the Loving Justice Plan to the CHRT. And I'm wondering, what do you see as the key differences between the government's plan and this plan? And is there anything in that plan that you've had a chance to look at that you think the government might potentially adopt or see eye to eye with?
I did read the plan when it came out. I thought, it was really important work. People who go to these engagement sessions and give their feedback, it is critical information. It helps not only, my colleagues working in this file have information, but it helps me too as a minister to see, okay, what is the general commentary that people are providing in this process. So I thought that, the report did
offer that perspective. The fundamental difference between the approach with what is in the Loving Justice report and what we are putting forward as a regional approach for me is really two things: that we are allocating funding directly to First Nations and First Nations agencies. So we are looking for that direct financing approach. I think this is what allows for efficiency and critical response to happen in a timely manner. The reporting and planning requirements, it's really trying to, create a structure that will allow for communities to be able to control and have access and to inform on what their data looks like, telling the story of what the regional portrait looks like. This is something that is really important to me. And lastly, the framework for accountability, it lies with the region. And this is something that, in all due respect, reporting to a national body is, yes, going to create a data set that will reflect what kids in care are looking like on a national scale. But I really, truly believe that, as a minister and working in the different files, it is quite apparent that needs, capacity, relationship with province, or even, location and the population of community are all things that are very, very different across this country. What we are looking for and what we are hearing from on the East Coast is quite different from the West Coast. And the things that we see emerging, in the middle of this country are quite different. So looking to drill down and have an intimate portrait and have that scaled data that reflects the specific needs of a nation is really the biggest difference for me. That governance component is a huge driving factor for me. And I think this is what is going to allow for greater success, especially in the capacity building realm. Looking to see what kind of critical support community needs allows for us to plan instead of having a national portrait of we need X number of workers in this field. We know that we can plan accordingly to provincial need and to regional need. And this is something that I think just allows for us to distribute better and really meet the needs. Sometimes, planning on a national scale, we go and seek funds for a certain type of role, and then it's not applicable everywhere. I want to balance and harmonize how we're supporting communities. And I think that's really done in a more closely connected and intimate way.
So there was a time when the federal government argued that it didn't have a mandate to negotiate with anyone except the Assembly of First Nations and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. But with this plan, am I correct to say that you're ready to negotiate separate agreements with separate jurisdictions?
I all respect for Assembly of First Nations. I think they do amazing work in that space. The fact of the matter is, there are some nations that don't participate in this body, either because they wish to do so or because they have direct relationship. I come from a role as a former Grand Chief where we always went to Assembly of First Nations to support on those national files, but we had a direct relationship with our province. So I could see both sides of the lens on who goes there to participate. I think that has had an influence on the realization that for me as a minister, I really respect the authority of First Nations and who they are as a community. And I also know and understand that when communities come together in unity and focus on what they want to bring to their region, it empowers them. It gives them a greater degree of scalability in what they're trying to do. It builds capacity. It's really needs driven. This is something that I feel very familiar with. I have a lot of faith in it, but the evolution of representation that came from the AFN. This is a file that was launched in Assembly that came from a resolution in Assembly. Certain groups have been mandated to work in this space. We are always being respectful and working with our colleagues at the Assembly of First Nations. I know that people have done a lot of important work. I'm not opposed to that continued engagement. I just feel that if we are going to meet the needs of First Nations in the spaces that they are in, we really have to be more intimate in our approach. So I believe that there's a lot of strength in regional agreements, and this is what I'm looking to pursue.
Great. Thank you so much, Minister Gull-Masty.
Thank you. Have a nice day. It was so lovely to talk to you.
That was Minister Mandy Gull-Masty, who unfortunately had to leave her interview early to get to Parliament Hill. Her staff did offer her up at a different time, but unfortunately we couldn't make it work. But we still want to know exactly how the government's plan is going to end discrimination. So we sent a request for comment to her office. Cindy Blackstock has been at the heart of this case against the government since the beginning. That's when she, as the executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, along with the AFN, launched the case in 2007. And almost 20 years later, she's still pushing. Blackstock worked with the National Chiefs Children Commission to come up with its plan, and they called it the Loving Justice Plan, or LJP. Cindy Blackstock joins me now to share more. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So to start, I want to ask you, does it feel like you've been fighting this case for nearly 20 years?
Yes, it does. Especially when I look at old photos of myself, I can see myself kind of changing over time. But you know what? First Nations children and families and their communities have been fighting it much longer. It's really about shifting Canada's history of discrimination towards First Nations children and families towards a direction of hope. And that's something that the residential school survivors in the TRC called for. And to me, my little contribution is nothing in light of the heavy lifting that they did and the responsibility that we all share to make sure that this discrimination stops.
Mm-hmm. And so, in these nearly 20 years, what would you say has been the biggest obstacle?
I think it's that the government not accepting responsibility for the real life impacts on children and families. Like when I look at the way that they approach it, it's often a budgetary approach. It's often one that's dehumanizing on the impacts on children and family on the ground. And it's one that frankly makes a lot of excuses for poor government behavior. And I think that they'd be so much further ahead if they just simply accepted full-throatedly their discrimination against children and families, and then organize themselves to implement fully the rulings of the tribunal. Because when we've seen them do that, it's been life-changing for children and families. We've also seen when they don't do that, it can be life-ending for children in a very serious way. So they need to kind of accept responsibility and take the solutions that are right there on a silver platter and implement them. That's their only job.
Mm-hmm. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the National Chiefs Children's Commission has put a plan together. I'm wondering if you could outline some of the main points.
Okay, so first of all, the Loving Justice Plan is really about ensuring that there are national minimum legal standards in Canada's conduct. Because what we've seen is, regardless of what public statements they may make or agreements they may make, they often will go back and breach those agreements and breach those talking points. So we need something that's enforceable against the government so that the worst elements of the discrimination never happen. And then on top of that, we need some regional variations that are created by the First Nations leadership and their experts in the region to meet local needs of children. That's the key piece on the Loving Justice Plan. Canada's plan has a national thing that's built on budgets, not on real world evidence. And their plan, says it's regional agreements, but really when you read the fine print, it's Canada dictates the parameters, and it's really about implementing what Canada wants without any national standards that are seriously enforceable or independent oversight.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, with the NCC's plan, will it have the federal government negotiate with separate jurisdictions, or is this more of a single national plan?
No, it's both. It's like national minimum standards that are enforceable against the government. And these are legal rulings that are already on the books. And then on top of that base of minimum standards, then we have regional agreements to meet local needs. So it's a yes and approach. And it actually, in both instances, would be legally enforceable. I think that that's really the key, is that there are multiple layers in loving justice, multiple pathways to getting that accountability. And there's multiple pathways to ensure public oversight of the government and to make sure that whatever happens next, it fully benefits children.
So we spoke to the minister earlier, and unfortunately, the interview ended quite abruptly. But one of the questions that I wanted to put to the minister is that this plan takes the federal government out of having a leading role in delivering services. Why did you think that was important?
Because they've discriminated against our kids for 156 years. It's that simple. And in fact, I think that a government that fully has taken on board its responsibilities, they were found to be willfully and recklessly discriminating against little kids in the worst case scenario, resulting in serious harms and linked to the deaths of several children. If they were truly taking that on board, they would welcome any oversight, any kind of minimization of their role, because they would want to do everything in their power to make sure that they don't do this again. They're choosing to want to retain a lot of power and discretion in the plan that they filed before the tribunal over First Nations and over First Nations children and families. So we don't think that's appropriate. And we really want to move this thing along so that children have the best protection. And the best protection is moving the federal government out to the side, reducing the number of decisions they make and reducing their discretion.
So something that was pointed out to me was there isn't any money outlined in the NCCC's plan. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to how that will work.
Well, I think that really talks about the big macro approach. Canada puts in a bunch of money and then divvies it up in their plan. Our plan starts with what are the needs of children? How do we respect the rights of children and the rights of First Nations? How do we make sure that whatever money's provided actually makes a difference for kids? And then if we see that things aren't working out as we intended, that we're able to course correct quickly and make those corrections. We didn't start with a big number. We started with what the outcomes that we want to see for children and families, which is an end to this discrimination and prevent its recurrence, and then build back up. The National Children's Chiefs Commission and the Caring Society have publicly said that the amount of money that they announced in Calgary is in the ballpark of what is needed. It's not so much a conversation of the amount of money, although that is that is something that's going to be important to talk about. It's really about how do you structure it to get the best outcomes for kids and how you hold the federal government accountable so they actually do pay whatever they say they're going to do. Because in that big Calgary announcement of the 48 billion, it sounded great until you read the fine print and realized they had total discretion over whether they would pay it, under what terms they would pay it, and they held on to a lot of control under that agreement.
So this was another question that I wanted to ask the minister, but unfortunately interview ended earlier. At the end of the day, these plans are supposed to explain how they will end discrimination. So how does the NCCC's plan do that?
It does it through a bunch of multiple pathways. First of all, it centers in the whole plan, ending Canada's discrimination. Canada is the one that needs to be held accountable. We do that. We're recommending to leadership that there be a group of experts, including children and youth with lived experience in the child welfare system, that would look at any policy that the federal government is putting forward for children and families, and then publicly report on the impacts on children's rights on that. That's one example. Right now, the federal government is behind closed door, and they're just launching these policies, often without any evidence and no consultation with First Nations. So that's one, the child impact assessment, it's called. Number two is to ask the tribunal to retain jurisdiction while we put out an alternative dispute mechanism. But we understand that it's going to take a while to get that designed in a way that First Nations will find effective and accessible. So we need both of those things to run at the same time. The other thing that we have is a litigation fund for First Nations. You've probably seen recently where it's been First Nations families under Jordan's principle who have had to go out and find pro bono counsel or use their own resources to try and hold Canada accountable to enforcing its own legal orders. We don't think that's fair. The federal government is using public money to litigate against elders and families and First Nations who are just simply seeking to hold Canada accountable to fulfill legal orders against it. So we would like to see a litigation fund set up to enable that process. And then making sure that we're counting outcomes at the end of the day. What is actually happening for children and families? We need to know that data, because that's how you detect whether the discrimination is going away or whether it's worsening.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but before I let you go, I'm wondering, what comes next in this process?
Well, one of the most important things is that loving justice was blessed in ceremony by elders and knowledge keepers on the solstice before it was filed. And there are spiritual obligations that we have now with that plan that need to be carried out under the guidance of elders and knowledge keepers. We really felt very strongly that we need to infuse it with spirit. The other thing I just want to mention just quickly is when you open Loving Justice, you actually see the words "we love you" in First Nations languages wrapping the whole legal submission, because we wanted to send that signal to children, not only a signal of promise. The tribunal has said now, we've seen Canada's report, we've seen Loving Justice, and they are right now making a decision around what happens next. We should be hearing that within the next week or so.
Cindy Blackstock, thanks so much again for making the time and sharing this with us.
Thanks for having me.
This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player, or email your suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.